Hello everyone, and welcome back. In today's video, we're going to be talking about the Wonderland saga. Now, I know a lot of people lost money on this project, and for that, I feel really bad for you. The point of this video is really to identify these types of projects in the future and to be able to avoid these types of founders in the future. Now, I know 99% of you already know what happened, so just to give a quick TLDR, ZachXBT on Twitter did some great investigating and found out that Danielle's basically partner in crime, 0xSaifu or Michael Patron, was already convicted of fraud, a serial scammer, and had already, kind of exploited about $200 million from users in this Quadriga scandal. Now, Saifu was anonymous to the community, but it actually turns out that Danielle knew who he was and kind of accepted his past as this fraudster and serial scammer. Obviously, this is a huge mistake and just shows his poor judgment in the situation. So this is already in the past, it's already happened, but going forward, how can we try to better avoid affiliating ourselves with these types of projects? Well, first and foremost, I think the big takeaway here is when you see the populist narrative run. So he was always saying things like, screw the suits, screw the VCs, I'm building this for just the common user. Now, this populist narrative is something that people employ all of the time to get people on their side, and it's usually quite effective, as it was in this case. Now, this to me is a huge turnoff just because it's such a prevalent narrative that works in politics to essentially get people on your side. I'm not picking on any specific politician here, but it's essentially the same as, Nancy Pelosi and Trump are both sides of the political aisle in the US. So on the left here, Nancy Pelosi is a Democrat. She's supposed to be a person of the people, but there's been a ton of memes coming out essentially explaining how Nancy Pelosi has drastically outperformed the market over the last year, and there was a ton of scandals about members of Congress and the Senate kind of trading on insider information surrounding COVID. So this tweet's kind of funny. It says, the best way to combat wealth inequality in the US is to allow citizens to copy Nancy Pelosi's trades in real time. I just think it's a funny example how you can see the politicians kind of drive home this narrative of we're working for the people, but behind closed doors, that's not always the case. And on the right here, you have an image of Trump with this kind of construction hat on. Trump always played up the image of being part of the blue-collar working class, when of course those are not the social circles he mainly interacted with. So we see this populist narrative all of the time in politics, and whenever I see it, I kind of immediately get turned off a bit just because it's so transparently not true for pretty much anyone that preaches this narrative. So the second takeaway here I think that you can use to evaluate projects going forward is usually when a project is a pure copy-paste fork of another project, it's generally just a cash grab. So to show you how prevalent these Olympus forks were, on the left here we can see a CoinGecko page, and we're just filtered here for the top rebasing token projects. If you're familiar with this model, it's what Wonderland uses to raise a treasury. It's what Olympus pioneered, and there's probably dozens, if not hundreds, of these Olympus forks now. Now, obviously not all of these projects are pure copy-paste forks, and not all of the teams are really just looking to get a cash grab, but it's something that will tip you off. If something is a pure fork, they're not really adding any innovation. The developers didn't put much time into it, and so therefore I would argue that generally you're going to see a lot of cash grabs. Now, the other example you can see, I have the Uniswap logo here. There are so many Uniswap V2 forks out there on every single different chain, and in my opinion, I would argue most of these don't really have any true value. They're just forks. They're not adding anything new. They're just kind of creating a new firm token out of thin air that they can pay users with and get a lot of liquidity on their platform. So the second sort of red flag that you can look for with future projects is that Wonderland always branded itself as a DAO. Danielle was always saying this was a community-run project, etc. But in reality, it never was a DAO. It was a DAO in name only. Just to highlight that, on January 17th, Danielle basically was saying that he was going to change the entire model of how Wonderland works because Wonderland suffered poor price performance on January 17th. The market kind of crashed and Wonderland was hit hard. And Danielle, as you can see here, basically said we're migrating away from the rebasing O model and we're going to become a SPAC in the crypto space. Now, if you're not familiar with a SPAC, it's a term from traditional finance. It stands for Special Purpose Acquisition Company. And as far as I can tell, Danielle was basically saying we're going to use our nearly $1 billion treasury to purchase new projects, to invest in new projects, etc. Now, of course, if this was a true DAO, this was something that would have to be debated, voted on, etc. There'd be a ton of input, but Danielle sort of just decided this. Now, I'm not saying this is wrong, but I'm saying the marketing that Wonderland was a DAO is wrong. It was certainly not a DAO. It never was a DAO. The community really never had any input on anything. Now, I would argue the more egregious example of this just occurred earlier today. So because of all of the internal conflict that's been happening with Wonderland, basically Danielle put up a vote to determine whether to sort of liquidate the treasury and return all of the assets to holders of the Wonderland token. Now, the vote is somewhat close. You can see that most people are voting at the time of recording this video not to return all of the assets, but Danielle actually sent out this tweet basically saying, we're going to liquidate the treasury regardless of what the community said. Now, to me, this is just a clear example that this is certainly not a DAO. It's controlled by, a handful of people. And I think really whether Wonderland should liquidate its assets or not is kind of irrelevant. There's pros and cons to both. But the fact that he's just blatantly disregarding the vote is a bit ridiculous. So next up, my thoughts on MIM. So if you're not familiar with MIM, it's an over-collateralized stablecoin issued by the Abracadabra app, and Abracadabra is another Danielle project. So MIM is over-collateralized, which means long-term it's at a very low risk of losing peg. That said, I would argue that there's very little reason to hold any MIM or take on any exposure to MIM right now. If you hold it, I would just swap to a different stablecoin. Now, the reason being is if Wonderland, which again is this DAO that Danny created that actually holds a bunch of MIM, millions and millions of dollars of MIM, if Wonderland does in fact return all of the underlying assets, which Danielle has said they would, there's actually not going to be enough exit liquidity for MIM. So this tweet thread on the right gives a good job of explaining it. This user here asks Danielle, how do you plan on selling all of the MIM from the treasury, seeing as there's not enough liquidity in the curve pool? Totally reasonable question. Danielle responds basically saying this is baseless FUD, but in fact it's not. If you look on chain, you can see that Curve in fact does not have enough liquidity to support Wonderland selling all of its MIM. This user continues on and he basically says, there's only $56 million of exit liquidity for MIM. How do you plan to offload the Wonderland treasury of MIM? He then goes on to say this really isn't about the MIM peg, it's about how you're actually going to liquidate this treasury. If you just distribute the underlying assets to users and they have to sell MIM, well, there's nowhere for them to actually sell it right now. So in my view, that could lead to a temporary depegging. We'll just have to see. I don't think it's guaranteed. And what that means is there might be a low-risk opportunity to actually short the MIM stablecoin. So how would one short the MIM stablecoin in sort of a low-risk or risk-free way? Well, if you trust the Abracadabra platform, again, that's another Danny project, but is largely seen as safe. If you trust this platform, you could essentially lock up an asset here and borrow the MIM stablecoin against that asset for virtually no cost. So for example, I'll just open up this WETH page here and I can deposit, say 20 WETH and I could borrow MIM against it. So 50% of 20 WETH, that would leave me with about $26,000 of MIM to borrow. And this is pretty low cost for me. You can see there's a 0.5% borrow fee, so you're pretty much taking on that cost. And there is no interest paid, so you're paying a one-time 0.5% fee. Now, if you do want to short MIM, the next step here would be to basically sell all of that MIM for another stablecoin, let's just say USDC. And if MIM depegs to the downside, let's say it goes down to 80 cents, then you can actually buy back that MIM cheaper with your USDC and then repay your loan. So this is essentially a low-risk way to short MIM if you think there might be an opportunity there. Now again, I'm not saying this is guaranteed or even likely, but it's a pretty low-risk bet of a 0.5% fee if you want to take that bet and see if MIM will depeg. So the next question people are asking is, if Wonderland is liquidating their treasury, they're returning the treasury to users, and the Wonderland token is trading below treasury value, should I buy Wonderland right now in hopes that when they send me the underlying assets, I can sell them for more than the price I paid for Wonderland? So in my mind, it's not worth buying the Wonderland tokens. Again, they go by wMEMO and time. I would argue there's too many unknowns. There's incompetent leadership that's kind of sporadic. We don't really know what they're going to do next, even though they said so. In addition, you're going to have problems liquidating the underlying assets. So if they just send you a bunch of MIM and they send a bunch of users a bunch of MIM, there might not be exit liquidity for a little while. And lastly, I would look at what's happening on chain, and when we look on Nansen, we're actually not seeing a lot of folks buying Wonderland tokens up in the hopes that they can capture that treasury value. And if we actually go over to Nansen here, we're on Avalanche, and we're looking at the token for wMEMO. Now, we're looking at notable walls here, and if we scroll down for top balances, and we sort by first in, you can see that there's really not much activity. Not many folks are buying the wMEMO token with the hopes that they can arbitrage this and extract the treasury value. In addition, you can see that none of these addresses have a label, so there's really no smart money coming in, and the size that these users are buying in is actually quite small. In addition, it's likely if this was really a good trade, you'd see a ton of users trying to do this, and really over the last 16 or so hours since this was announced, there hasn't been much activity, so to me that tells me it's probably not worth speculating on. I don't think you'll be able to liquidate the underlying assets and really profit from this, but of course it is possible. That said, once again, for me to think this was really a good idea, I'd really expect a lot of smart money users to be doing this. So what's next for these so-called Frog Nation projects? Well, first off, I think Wonderland is clearly done for, and again, it's probably not worth speculating on this redemption arbitrage strategy. Next is Popsicle Finance. If you're not familiar with that project, it's essentially a Uniswap v3 automated concentrator for liquidity, and really they don't have product market fit yet. So if you actually look at the data, most of those concentrated v3 positions actually lose money because of impermanent loss, and they certainly underperform Uni v2 positions, so not much product market fit there, not too bullish there. Abracadabra is next. I actually think this is a great product. I've covered it a couple times and I will link those videos in the top right. I think there's really something there. I do think they need to step more away from Danny, which they're doing, so I think Abracadabra could have a bright future. But the sleeper here that no one's really talking about is SushiSwap. So last week it was actually formalized that Danny would take over control of Sushi, and he's announced that he's stepping back from Sushi, and right now there's sort of this power vacuum at SushiSwap. There's no one actually leading the project. I think most folks in DeFi want to see SushiSwap succeed, but I do think a leader has to step in and sort of take control and steer the ship and make sure they actually launch Trident, which is sort of their V2 release and their Uniswap v3 competitor. So that's all I have to cover for this Wonderland drama. I think next week is going to be very interesting, and I'm looking forward to seeing how this all unfolds. Now with that said, thank you so much for watching this video, and I look forward to seeing you all in the next one.